Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. We're going to go ahead and just give it 1 minute for stragglers to join the meeting and not miss anything. So we'll start at 7:31 if that's all right with everyone. All right, even as I'm speaking, I'm getting last minute email notifications that people are still registering. So we'll just let them trickle in. My name is Sophia Zanowski. I am the Registrar and Director of Development at St. Bernard's. I'm very excited to be here with you all this evening. A couple of housekeeping items and introductions before we get started. So just some IT related things. We ask that you stay muted throughout the duration of the event. We're going to do some introductions. Dr. Frank is going to give her presentation, and then we're going to move into a Q&A at the end. So we just ask that you stay muted for the duration of her presentation. We're also going to turn off the chat box just so that it's not distracting throughout her presentation, so you don't see the little notifications, and then we'll turn it back on during the Q&A. So hold on to your questions until then. I will put my email in the chat box so you have it in case you run into any technical difficulties. You can feel free to email me. I'll try to troubleshoot those with you. But don't worry, if your Wi-Fi goes out or anything like that, we are recording this lecture and we will provide it to you probably tomorrow or Monday in a follow-up email, so you won't miss anything in case you want to go back and view it. And then when we do get to the Q&A, feel free to put your question in the chat box, either in full and I will read it, or if you have kind of a larger question, if you want to give me the topic of your question and then I'll call on you, let me know if you want me to call on you and you can speak your question aloud, and you can unmute yourself and do that. We will run it either way with Q&A, whatever you're comfortable with. So I do want to give a brief introduction about who St. Bernard's is. For any of you who are not familiar with us, we are a graduate theological school located in upstate New York with campuses in Rochester and Albany, although we serve students from across the state and across the country through our distance education program. We have master's degrees in theology and philosophy. And we also have 4 certificate programs that I like to tell our event attendees about because we find that these are really exciting to people who come to our events. So these certificate programs, you can take a cluster of topics or a cluster of courses on a niche topic. And you get to take these graduate courses without needing a bachelor's degree or really committing to a full master's degree. We have 4 of them: a certificate in Catholicism and the Fine Arts, a certificate in Catholic bioethics, one in catechetical leadership, and one in Catholic philosophy. So we find that people who maybe never really want to go the full master's route still might want to come back, take some of our classes, between 4 to 6 classes on one of those topics. We also love doing events like this. This is one of my favorite parts of my job. And since I am the Director of Development, I wanted to thank anyone who donated at the time of registration. Of course, very voluntary, but we really appreciate it. So it helps us do things like this. And on that note, I want to give a brief plug for a couple of upcoming offerings that we have. So we just announced that this summer, we are going to open up all of our courses to be audited by anyone for free. 1 course this summer for free. Auditing is really great. My mother loves to do this because you get to sit in on the lectures, participate in the discussions, do all the readings, but you don't have to do any of the papers or any of the other assignments. So very low stakes, very self-enriching, but you don't really have to kind of commit to anything there, and you can audit 1 for free this summer. We do have a virtual open house happening on March 23rd. where we'll talk more about this initiative and also our graduate program. So if you're interested in learning more about that, you can come to the open house. We also run 2 event series monthly. We have our Words with Wine series, where each month we pick a different modality of the fine arts and talk about the intersection of that art with faith. So this month, on March 18th, 2 weeks from today, our very own professor of theology, Sister Nancy Hawkins, will be leading a discussion on the film of Gods and Men. We've been running that for almost a year now, since we started it right at the height of the pandemic. And those are always really fun. And then we also run this series, Theology and Culture, which kind of are just on niche topics, what's going on in the world today and how does our faith impact that, or how, vice versa. In April, on April 8th, our next Theology and Culture will be Sister Grace Miriam from the Religious Sisters of Mercy in Michigan. She's also a medical doctor, and she will be talking about the healing role of religion and a bit of her story of what it was like to be a doctor back in April when the pandemic really picked up. I'll be sending out a follow-up email after this event that has a lot of links to all of these things, so you can learn more about anything that I spoke about that might have piqued your interest. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to our president, Dr. Laughlin, to give a brief introduction of our speaker, Dr. Angela Franks.
Thank you, Sophia. Good evening and welcome to Theology and Culture, a series that seeks to engage its participants in conversations concerning the Catholic faith and how we might manifest this in today's world. My name is Dr. Stephen Laughlin, and I am the president of St. Bernard's School of Theology and Ministry, the sponsor and organizer of this series. Our presenter tonight is Dr. Angela Franks. Dr. Franks is a theologian, speaker, writer, and mother of 6. She serves as professor of theology at St. John's Seminary in Boston, having received her training from Boston College, the Catholic University of America, and the University of Dallas. Her areas of specialty include the theology of the body, the new evangelization, the Trinity, Christology, and the thought of Pope St. John Paul II and Hans Urs von Balthasar. Dr. Franks is currently focused on bringing key ideas in contemporary continental philosophy into conversation with the Catholic intellectual tradition. An experienced speaker, she has spoken at numerous conferences, including the International Theology of the Body Congress, and on EWTN, Fox News, and many other outlets. She has been published in America Magazine, First Things, Public Discourse, Church Life Journal, Catholic World Report, The Plough, and academic journals such as Theological Studies, Christian Bioethics, Nova et Vetera, Communio, The Thomist, and National Catholic's Bioethics Quarterly, in addition to contributing chapters to edited books. She's written 2 books, one on sexual ethics entitled Contraception and Catholicism, What the Church Teaches and Why, and the other on the history of eugenics entitled Margaret Sanger's Eugenic Legacy, The Control of Female Fertility. Dr. Franks will lead us tonight in an exploration of what Catholicism has to say on the topic of the body and its masculine or feminine aspect. The title of her talk is The Sexed Body, What is it for? In the course of which she will address topics such as, why are human beings male or female? Is gender fluidity real? Does maleness and femaleness have a purpose? Does Christianity denigrate the body? And other pressing matters. And so, without further delay, let us warmly welcome Dr. Angela Franks.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here, and I see surprisingly, a couple of my students who have already heard me talk on this topic, so I don't know what they're thinking, but I'm glad they're here as well. Let's get to the beginning here. So as was said, I am doing a lot of thinking about this topic, and the topic in particular of the body. It's kind of interesting for us to think about the fact that we are here having a talk dedicated to theology and culture that centers around the body. The fact that this has already become something that we want to talk about is under this rubric is already an interesting idea. All right, I have to get rid of this panel up here. This only happens when I'm in Zooming. It's never happens when I'm like on my regular computer. So let's see if I can move it across this way. I can't get to my starting my PowerPoint. I can't remember how I solved this problem last time. Wait, let's see if I can move it this way.
Angela, down at the bottom right-hand corner of your
Yes.
screen, you have the little rectangle on the stick.
Rectangle and a stick. That one.
There you go.
Slideshow. Thank you. Excellent. There we go. All right. So why do we have the sex body? I forgot I said what is the purpose. So I just made it even simpler here. Why do we have the sex body? And so this is really not a topic that we were even raising all of that much, say 30 years ago when I was doing undergraduate theology, but becoming more and more now something to really think about. And so we really have to start by asking, what do we mean by sex? And when I'm going to use the term sex in this talk, I'm referring to maleness and femaleness, which is how, in fact, John Paul II always uses it. And I'm going to talk about three ideas. I'm going to talk about maleness and femaleness. I'm going to talk about the human body more generally. And then I'm going to talk about the problem that I think is underneath why we keep asking these questions, which is the modern problem of identity. So let's start with just thinking about what is it that makes a man or a woman. And these days, people seem to say, well, it seems to be a matter of a profound inner feeling, or maybe is it our genes, or maybe primary or secondary sex characteristics. So if the genes, as happens in rare cases, if the genes are ambiguous, or if the primary or secondary sex characteristics are ambiguous, then what do we, how do we make sense of this? And I think it really helps to back up a little bit and look at what it means to be human. So the characteristics of human nature. And so first of all, it's important to realize these days that it is human to be either male or female. In other words, this isn't something you find in all animals. Even, amoebas, for example, aren't male or female. So there's something unique to higher, more advanced animals that they come as masculine or feminine. And the reason these higher animals are sexually differentiated as either masculine or feminine really gets back to the problem of reproduction, the question of reproduction. We have maleness and femaleness because there are two different ways that human beings contribute to reproduction, that males contribute, as this is what Aristotle used to say, males contribute by reproducing outside of themselves and females by inside of themselves. And now we know that's because of spermatozoa and ova, things that Aristotle didn't know about. But this basic distinction, reproducing outside or inside of your body, really cuts across all of the higher animals. The fact that there are people who have challenges with reproduction doesn't make the sex differences any less real. It just means, just like there are people who have challenges, say, with digestion or with respiration, that doesn't make digestion and all of the organs that contribute to digestion, it doesn't make those less real. It just means that sometimes things break down. The bodily processes don't work the way that they're supposed to, but there still is a goal to these bodily processes. And it's important to realize this nature that we have is stable. Now, there's a lot about us that is not stable, and I'm going to talk about that and try to give that real space to think about what about us is not stable. But our nature is stable. We are human, and we don't have the option of not being human, just like the amoeba doesn't have an option of not being an amoeba. So those things about us are constant. So in order to understand a little bit better, we're talking about reproduction and the fact that you need both male and female in order to reproduce. And so this is the dreaded sex binary that you've probably heard people refer to, the sex binary. That's really the beginning of the conversation, and it's not the end of the conversation, because just because you have male and female, that's not yet now saying, what is it that I feel about being male or female? How is it that I'm going to act out, in my case being female? What about the cultural expectations? Are those just or unjust? And so the biological level of sex is really the beginning of talking about the richness of maleness and femaleness, and not the end of it. And so this is the distinction that first started getting kind of academic play in the 1970s, that sex is biological, but the term gender was developed to explain these cultural and experiential aspects of living out being male or female. And there are people who have some sound objections to this distinction, but I think it does have its usefulness, because so much of what we're concerned about when it comes to masculinity or femininity is not really happening at the biological level. It's happening at the level of culture or stereotypes, for example, or particular vulnerabilities, for example, that women have, being weaker. Like, how does that work out in the culture? Those are really useful things to have a name for. And so I think that this distinction has its uses. The problem is that pretty quickly, the distinction fell into absurdities. And so what ended up happening was a dual divide. And this you start to see among philosophers pretty clearly already by the 1980s or so, that gender, first of all, was understood to be divided from sex. And so all of that cultural and experiential living out of sex was understood to somehow just be free floating, and no longer had to have any reference to maleness or femaleness at all. It was just its own thing. And then, even somewhat more weirdly, sex, maleness and femaleness, became divided from the body. This is something you see in somebody like Judith Butler, who's the most well-known kind of pioneering gender theorist, who says that bodily sex is completely socially constructed. More or less, that's what she says. And so this is, she's understandably vague about how this actually works, as far as the level of molecules or genes or so forth. But this becomes especially troubling, because now sex is understood to be something completely independent from the body, and that's really where we are. And so now people are trying to talk about a bodily distinction without making reference to the body at all. And this is especially worrisome for people who have concerns about women's rights. And this has just very recently been in the news because of federal legislation moving forward that would elevate gender, how one identifies one's gender, to the same level as bodily sex. And a lot of feminists have concerns about this, because they're looking at things like women's sports or so forth and saying, well, how can we argue for women's rights if woman doesn't mean anything except how you feel or how you choose to identify? And so it's actually a very dangerous thing for feminist cultural critique, because they can't anymore argue that there's this class of women that are just objectively distinguished, that everybody can recognize. All right, so what does this leave us? So it leaves us, if sex is something that is just simply performed into being, and really has nothing to do with your body, then there's no reason at all why there should be only two sexes, because that's just arbitrary. If sex is really a matter of how I feel, there could be 3 or 30,000 sexes, or as many sexes as there are people, right? So sex has quickly started to mean nothing at all. And the gender binary has been assumed to be just simply a power play, right? That people are trying to exclude other people. So because of this, a lot of people think that the term gender is just not usable anymore, for good reason. And so I have this very small little cottage industry where I'm trying to make a case for replacing the term gender with the phrase sex lived out. because I think that really gets at the truth of what the gender category was supposed to express, that it's how we live out our maleness and our femaleness. But it's rooted in our maleness and our femaleness. So to explore this a little more, let's expand our scope from just simply sex to now looking at more about the human body and human nature. So if we're talking about reproduction, as I began the conversation with, then we're talking about the fact that we are animals, because only animals can reproduce, only animals can reproduce sexually. But we're a particular kind of animal, namely we're rational animals. So we have these powers to think and to love, which are spiritual powers that are not, strictly speaking, dependent on our body. Now, of course, we have brains, right? And that's material. And so this seems strange to say that our power to think wouldn't be dependent on our body, but the power itself might use a material instrument like a brain, but the power itself is spiritual. Like, you can't actually see my thoughts right now. They're only good. I'm thinking good thoughts about you. But that's like why in cartoons we have the little thought bubbles, that appear, because our thoughts are actually invisible. They're not material. You can't take a picture of them. They transcend our matter. And so this makes a human being very complex, that we're not just an animal and we're not just spiritual, but we're this mixture of the two. And so because of this, if we have these two aspects of ourselves, it's really easy to pick sides. And that's what a lot of philosophy has done, and a lot of just casual thinking about ourselves. We tend to either go to a kind of monism that says, well, we're either completely spiritual or we're completely material, and it just the two kind of wind up being the same thing. Or we go into this what's called dualism, where we say the spiritual and material are opposed, and in fact they're at war with each other. And this is what a lot of people think Christianity does, that it puts the spirit and the body at war. In fact, Christianity's been the major and most of the time only opponent to this kind of dualism, in particular as it is expressed in what's called Gnosticism, which is a dualism that puts down the body, that sees the body as being less. Christianity's argue, no, in fact, we are fully spiritual, and yet we are also material, and the two are not, you can't separate them out, and the two have to coexist. And I'm going to talk more about that. The language, the philosophical language that the church didn't invent, but has really claimed for this interpenetration of spirit and matter, is called hylomorphism, which sounds very, very fancy cocktail party word. I've actually never been to a cocktail party, but I gather, you could throw around big words like that. But it simply just means matter formism in Greek. That's all it means, that we are this material reality that is formed by a spiritual soul. And so our soul is what orders our body into this coherent living whole. And it's a particular kind of ordering because it has these spiritual powers that it gives us as well. And so for us, having this spiritual soul, this makes us different from the other animals. And people, anybody who has a dog wants to say, but really, my dog is really smart. And you don't understand if you think that I'm somehow superior, or human beings are somehow superior, because like other animals can be wonderful. I totally concede that your dog is everything you say that your dog is. But your dog has never appeared in my class, and I'm guessing is never registered for one of St. Bernard's certificates, right? Why? Because we're the only animals who can ask the kinds of questions that raise us above the material world and make us really wonder about the world. Dogs and chipmunks and Squirrels don't wonder about the world. They might be very adept at living in the world, but they don't ask questions like, why am I here? Why is there a sexed body? They don't even ask the very basic questions like, is there traffic on the Southeast Expressway today? They just don't ask those kinds of questions. And so we are able to do that because we have this, we have a body, but we also have this spiritual soul that enlivens our body. A contrary view that's very popular today, this is from a tattoo parlor near my house, which I think is still in business despite the pandemic, though I'm not positive. Ghost in the machine, right? So this is a really common idea that like our body is a machine and our soul is sort of a ghost in the machine and kind of rattling around inside it. This I think is a very bad image because first of all, to view the body as a machine is a really limited idea. Machines have parts, and when the parts wear out, the only relevant question is, can I replace them with other parts, right? It's really you view machines in a very utilitarian sort of way. Do they work or do they not work? And if they don't work, you either fix them or you get rid of them. But our bodies aren't like that, right? We don't just simply discard them, or we shouldn't just discard them just because they're not working as well as we want them to. But we tend to bring that machine mentality to our body. And so if our bodies are not machines, which is about as good as our culture can do in thinking about the body, then what are they? So this is a point where John Paul II's thought, his theology of the body, is especially helpful. And one of his basic ideas in the theology of the body is that the body expresses the person. So our bodies, instead of just being machines or just being something that weighs us down that we want to discard, our bodies have a purpose in our, what John Paul II calls our personal structure. And that purpose is to express. Our bodies make visible the unique person that we are. And without our bodies, we're not visible, we're not tangible. We can't be sensed. And so I think this is a very, if you let this idea sink in, it's a very liberating idea because of the utilitarian ideas toward the body that our culture has. It's like, well, our bodies are rarely good enough. Are they fit enough or healthy enough or attractive enough or whatever, thin enough, all that stuff. And JP2 just really is thinking on a completely different plane, just kind of discards all those questions. And he's saying, your body is already doing exactly what it was created to do, which is expressing you. It does not have to be fixed in order to express you. And so this means that the language you sometimes hear that people are born in the wrong body is really a misunderstanding of this whole personal structure that we have, because your body is always expressing you. It's not expressing anyone else. It's always expressing you. So it's never wrong in that sense. John Paul II says a lot more. It's a very thick book, but one more relevant idea for our purposes that he says is that he talks about the body as a primordial sacrament, and he puts it sort of in scare quotes. He doesn't mean literally that the body is one of the 7 sacraments or something like that, but he says, think about what a sacrament is. A sacrament is, as I have there on the slide, it's a visible sign of invisible grace. That's what a sacrament is. He says our bodies do that kind of thing in that they make visible an invisible reality, namely the person. We're going to see, I'm going to talk a little bit at the end of the talk, how they also, according to John Paul II, actually make visible God himself in a very distant kind of way as well. And so there's this rich sense in which our body is a sacrament. So that's a much different vision than our body being a machine. Let's talk a little bit more. This is these levels I got not from John Paul II, but from another theologian, Bernard Lonergan. But John Paul II loved to talk about integration. So how is it that we, as this complex personal structure, how do we live comfortably in our own skin, the way people say, which is by no means automatic for us after the fall. And so I think it's helpful to realize that we have all of these different levels to ourselves, and that the goal for human flourishing is to integrate them, as I'll talk about. So let me just talk quickly about these levels. So it goes from kind of the most basic and the most universal to the most specific and singular. So on the physical level, we're just talking about the fact that material realities interact with forces of gravity, and talking about the electrons and atomic structure and all that. So this is really shared by all material creatures. Then the chemical level, now we're talking about compounds and elements. And so this starts to be differentiated, starts to look a little different. Now, when you get to the level of the biological, this is the level where maleness and femaleness appear. And so the level of the biological is the level of life. So obviously starting with plants and up through animals. But the biological gets more complicated, now you have maleness and femaleness, because when you have life, you have the passing on of life, reproduction. More complicated animals, including your dog, start to have the ability for social and emotional powers. Unlike, say, your sunflowers, your dog does certainly, express fear and so forth. With us, that stuff becomes a lot more complicated, a lot richer. And ultimately, it's because the highest level, being rational and being free, so our powers to know and to love, that's what where all of these things are leading for the human person. So John Paul II looks at this kind of idea and says, what we need to do with our knowing and our choosing, with our intellect and our freedom, is to integrate and embrace all of the different levels and let them all be directed toward the purpose of our knowing and our loving. But we shouldn't use our minds and say the technology that comes out of our intelligence. We shouldn't use that to reject the lower levels, or say, well, I'll be fine if I don't have to worry about biological life at all. And this is the transhumanism movement. That's kind of going to be the next thing on the scene. John Paul II is like, no, we use our knowing and our loving to integrate, which means accepting all of these levels and turning them toward God's purpose for us. And so this integration, because this integration is not automatic, especially after the fall, and because it requires some work, he likes to call this, he uses this language all the time, he calls this a task. And it's interesting, he says, he singles out maleness and femaleness, the sexed body, as a task. So he writes, the Creator has assigned the body to man as a task, the body and its masculinity and femininity. And in that masculinity and femininity, he has assigned to him in some way his own humanity as a task. So this is the task of accepting and integrating our masculinity and femininity. And the goal towards which this integration is oriented is what he calls the spousal meaning of the body. And so he doesn't mean by this that this only pertains to spouses or something like this. This pertains to all human beings. It's that our bodies in their masculinity and femininity reveal that we are made for self-gift, because we are incomplete on our own. The male can't reproduce without the female can't without the male. And this points to the fact, John Paul II says, that we are made for self-gift. So our integration is meant to serve that spousal self-gift, which is, again, lived out in all of the states of life. So there's a philosopher who writes about this, talking about how the difference of the sexes is ordered toward union. And he said this is really true of all human beings. So any isolated individual is lacking an essential power of all living things, the power of generation, right? We can digest and breathe on our own, but we can't reproduce on our own. So we can say that the power of generation is divided precisely so that it can be reunited. So again, order toward self-gift. And the fact that there are only two sexes needed for reproduction is another thing to ponder here. Why only two? Why just male and female? Why the binary? So another philosopher, D.C. Schindler, writes, the other sex is not simply inside of one, as in plants, but in a certain respect lies at the other extreme of human nature. To cross from the one to the other, we might say, entails passing through the whole world. This is why the union of the sexes in man is not a momentary event, an episodic occurrence, as in other animals, but a unity of existence, which involves the whole person and includes the work of intellect and will, the ascent of freedom. And so Schindler emphasizes that what you have with the difference of sexes, it's not a difference like the difference between apples and oranges, where, you know, oranges could just as easily be the difference between apples and jazz or apples and bubblegum or whatever. He says the difference between the sexes is like the difference between hot and cold. They're what Aristotle calls contraries. And it's what Aristotle says the difference of contraries is a perfect difference. And so that's why Dr. Schindler calls his article Perfect Difference, because you have this difference of contraries where it's two and only two are the contrary of each other. And why do we know it's only two? Because it's only two that contribute to reproduction. This idea that we're passing through the whole world as you pass between one sex and the other. So what we're seeing here is that our human nature is structured in a certain way. We're either male or female, but that difference that we might think is limiting, that there's only two, is actually a space for freedom. So in this, I am reminded of a study that one of my students told me about, where researchers took a group of kids and they put one group in a playground that had a fence around it, and the other group in a playground that didn't have a fence. And guess which group explored the most? It's the group with the fence. The group with the fence like went all the way to the edges, probably climbed up the fence and everything, you know, like they explored the whole terrain. Whereas without the borders, the group kind of didn't feel secure and they kind of huddled more in the center, right, close to each other. And that's just how we are. Like we feel the most freedom when we have boundaries and restrictions and order. So the boundaries of our nature give us the space to be creative. And this idea of creativity was really important to John Paul II, here writing before he was Pope. He has this funny line where he says, man is a being, so to speak, doomed to creativity. We can't help but be creative. And so creativity is not only you know, something to be tolerated, it's actually just very natural and human and good, but it operates within boundaries, within structure. So, and it's wired into us though as persons. And so he says, even all the way to the resurrected body. So this is from Theology of the Body. The man of the future world will find in this new experience of his own resurrected body the fulfillment of what he carried in himself perennially and historically, as an inheritance, and even more so as a task, an objective. So this idea that this experience of the resurrected body is going to be like the culmination of how we lived in our body creatively, viewing it as a task of acceptance and integration and creativity. So this kind of idea of that John Paul II has of our body as a task is actually picks up on a lot of the things that people want when they want things like gender performativity, or, you know, when they want to have that creativity. It just places that creativity when it comes to our body within the natural bounds that are already there. We can't perform ourselves out of maleness or femaleness, but we can perform within the limits of our maleness and femaleness in a genuinely creative way. And that Jean Paul II is actually very supportive of that way of thinking. But where is this creativity ordered to? So what's the kind of the practical meaning of maleness and femaleness? This is a very difficult question, and I'm only going to cover a little bit of it, but I think it's really helpful to remember that since maleness and femaleness is ordered toward reproduction, that means that we're going to find the meaning of maleness and femaleness ultimately in parenthood, either fatherhood or motherhood. And this might be actual fatherhood or motherhood for most of us probably, but for everybody, there is a spiritual fatherhood and motherhood that we're called to live out, to recognize that our maleness and femaleness really has a purpose that's this nourishing and nurturing in self-gift to others. We can say a little bit more, and so here I'm going to rely on Deborah Savage, who has done some work on the book of Genesis, and she talks about the woman after she's made in Genesis 2, who is labeled as a helper before Adam. And so some people kind of bristle at this term helper because it's like, what, she's there to do his laundry or something? Like, really? That's why we have women. But that's really a misunderstanding of the Hebrew language there. So she talks about kekenegdo in the helper, or the preposition that she says means in front of, in the sight of, before in the spatial sense. And so we must recognize that woman is not below man in the order of creation, neither is she above him. She stands in front of him, before him, meeting his gaze, as it were, and sharing in the responsibility for the preservation of all that precedes them. After all, in Genesis 1:27, both male and female are given the command to subdue the earth and fill it, both of them. And so this helper, in fact, in Hebrew, that name is given most of the time to God, who is Israel's help. And so not in the sense of being a slave, obviously, but in a sense of being the one who supports them and who is in many ways guiding them but at the very least side by side with them. And so this language of helper before him points to that the importance of the role of the woman, unlike all the other animals. But even more, Deborah Savage talks about the initial experiences of Adam and Eve. So Adam is created from the dust of the ground, and Eve is created from Adam's rib. And so she writes, while man's first experience of his own existence is of loneliness, which is related in Genesis 12, woman's horizon is different right from the start. From the first moment of her own reality, woman sees herself in relation to the other. And so Dr. Savage's work emphasizes that there's this natural ability of the male to be focused outwardly, and a natural ability of the female to pay attention to others. And both of these are good, and both of them get corrupted in the fall. And so it's not a matter of one being better than the other, but really of two different basic stances of the human being. So I just want to remind us again of the integration slide, because what I want to talk about quickly is about transgenderism and how transgenderism really does not grasp this picture of the different levels of the human person and the fact that the biological is where you find male and female. And so in transgenderism, what we find is that very often the body is portrayed as the enemy of the soul or of the person. But integration tells us that no, the body's not the enemy, it's just a lower level. The body's not opposed to the soul. Transgenderism also implies that sex begins at the higher levels, usually the emotional, I think. I feel like I'm a male, something like that. Whereas we have to remember sex is rooted in the biological, and it doesn't begin in the emotional. Transgenderism also has a tendency, in the case of gender dysphoria, or even people who aren't especially expressing gender dysphoria, it has a tendency to view maleness or femaleness as a pathology, as a mistake. But maleness and femaleness is just the way human beings are meant to be. And so the challenges with that come with things like gender dysphoria aren't a problem with the body, because the body is naturally good as male or female. So the task of the higher levels isn't to force the lower levels to change, like to say, okay, I'm going to think about how can I become a male and change my biology, but rather to use our reason and our freedom to integrate these lower levels. So the last section, major section here that I want to talk about, the last major theme, is the theme of identity. And I use this idea of the 90-degree turn as far as how it is that we're constructing or thinking about our identity. And I'll explain that shortly. But for complex reasons that I can't really get into here, identity is a problem today in ways that it wasn't in previous ages. So, in previous ages, if I were to say, who am I? I'd probably say, I'm a Christian serf working on the lands of the Lord of Heidelberg. I'm assuming, because I'm sure my ancestors were peasants. We couched our identity very much in terms of our family. I come from the family France, right? And our social economic status. Today, we sit in our custom modular furniture and look out the window and think, who am I, right? Like, it becomes a matter of introspection. It's something we do apart from our social embeddedness and apart from our relationships. And I think, in fact, there's actually a lot of good things about moving away from our identity being so dependent on our status and on our family and so forth. But we are very much unrooted. We're not embedded anymore, and we're kind of left on our own to figure this stuff out. So the result of this is that the identity question, making our identity up from scratch, is actually something that we're not capable of doing. This is my argument. We're not capable of answering in an adequate way, who am I, and just inventing it from nothing. Except some people are good at this. Those people are usually pathological. The people who are capable of doing this pretty well, just kind of turning on a dime and inventing new identities, tend to suffer from personality disorders, in particular personality disorders like narcissism. And so this idea is why people, beginning with Christopher Lasch in the late 70s and certainly continuing through today, have argued that we have a culture of narcissism, which doesn't mean that we're all pathological, like somebody who literally has narcissistic personality disorder, but just that our culture demands us to do the kinds of things that encourage narcissism. So it's like there's a narcissism spectrum that we're all sort of on. It's pressuring us to construct our identities instead of receiving them. This, I think, is the underlying reason why gender is such a hot topic, because for reasons I'll talk about briefly, gender and the bodies become the focal point. It's become the lightning rod for how we construct our identities. So in contrast to this, in contrast to the culture of narcissism where we're constructing our identities, I think it's helpful to realize that we can think of this in terms of this flow that and I call it vertical because I'm thinking, kind of picture-wise, that we come from God and we're meant to return to God. And so our identity is something that primarily we're meant to receive, because we don't construct ourselves. We come into existence because of our creator, and we receive it in particular from love, right? The fact that we receive it from God means we're not just kind of, it's not something we need to be afraid of, but it's actually something that we can rejoice in, that we can receive this identity in love. What we have done since our culture has become secular, so this is the 90-degree secular turn, is that we, instead of being aware at a just from how we viewed the world, of that vertical relationship from God, that we come from God and we go to God, we turned all of that 90 degrees. And so instead of flowing from God and back to God, now everything is happening on this inner worldly level, on this secular level. And so what this means is all of this, I think there's this huge amount of kind of energy of this movement from God and back to God. It's one reason why we like movement so much and we like going fast, and we enjoy that. Why? Because like that's kind of our life, that we're meant to move to God. We're on this journey to God. And when all of that gets turned 90 degrees, then there's an urgency to that desire to move and to flow, that we invest into finite things. And so finite desires invested with infinite urgency is a bad combination. And because the things that we're focused on are never going to satisfy our desires for God, for the infinite. And so we just get very restless. And it's one reason why, there's always a new cause, a new gadget, right? We're always kind of looking for new things to direct all of this urgency to, because we're not finding our home, which is the infinite God. In particular, all of this flow kind of gets, I think, turned on things that are too seem too immovable. So remember, I talked about how our nature is stable, and part of that is that we're male and female, and that's a stable reality. And our culture these days tends to turn on things that seem like stable institutions, because we see those as threats very often. And so all of that fallen, as a result of that 90-degree turn, we're fighting now the body. And in particular, why this is, and I have a whole article on this. So I have my websites up on the slides, and if you're interested, you can find some of my writing that I've dedicated to this. But I talk about the fact that the body has become like this kind of quasi-religious thing, and I talk about it in terms of totemism. I'm not an anthropologist. I'm just using what Freud says. He might not even be right about totemism, but it's really applicable to what we do with the body. So 4 qualities really of a totem: that a totem identifies a tribe, it fascinates them, it distracts them from other problems that might be going on, and ultimately the totem animal is ritually sacrificed. And so how does this apply to the body? So we use the body to identify our tribe. And so this is like a shortcut to the identity problem, right? So we go find our tribe. And so by taking on a new gender identity, for example, all of a sudden it's like an identity suit off the rack, right? You can just grab and go. You don't have to try to sew it yourself. The body fascinates us and also distracts us from our spiritual soul, because if you think of that body expressing the person dynamism, the body is the visible thing that we're always seeing. The person is this invisible kind of diffuse reality that it's like, I could become a good person. That sounds hard and difficult. What's much more straightforward is like, I'm just going to go to the gym, right? And work out a lot. Like we tend to reduce our personal goals to things that have to do with our body, because it's right there. It's kind of ready to hand. But if we invest the body with all of this religious meaning, it also is the thing that we blame when things go wrong. And so it's the thing that gets sacrificed. So, if something's wrong with our psyche, we're quite often liable to think, well, the problem is something's wrong with my body. And you see this, for example, with eating disorders, but I think these days you're also seeing that really often with transgenderism, where people aren't comfortable with who they are. And it's very easy, especially today, to blame our body. And so that's what gets sacrificed. The problem is, and so I'm going back to Professor Schindler on this, that if we trivialize the gender difference, as he says, it's to undercut the principle of difference simply It therefore is to therefore flatten out all being in principle, and so, among other things, to render reality a helpless prey of arbitrary technological projects. There's something really, the irreducibility of the male-female difference is a challenge. And if we run away from that challenge and we try to find like something in between or something that's non-binary or something, we're actually refusing the challenge of difference, of interacting with someone who's really different than me and who might view the world really different than me, and to then just kind of make difference a matter of, surgery and hormones and so forth. All right, so my conclusion, I am just going to very briefly summarize what I've talked about, and then I'm going to point in a more theological direction that I haven't really had time to talk about in this talk, but it kind of gets you a sense of where you can go with this topic. So first of all, the sexed body is always about, the body. In particular, it's about how we reproduce. Sex, maleness and femaleness, is a perfect difference of opposition. Male implies the female, and the female, vice versa, implies its opposite, the male. That's the perfection of this difference of opposition. So there's something really important about this kind of difference. How individuals live out their sex is dependent on, of course, their biology, but then also there are all of these cultural and individual factors that often go under the name of gender. And I think it's foolish not to recognize that obvious truth. But the body, in all of the cultural and psychological things that can challenge us, the body is not the problem when it comes to psychological challenges and spiritual challenges, that those are properly psychological and spiritual. So we're called to integrate the body and not to negate it. We can talk about the body's purpose. The body's purpose is to reveal the person, but then also the body's meaning, which is that the human person is fulfilled through fruitful self-gift, through love, ultimately. Now, we come from God, we return to him, and I think this is why fluidity is such a comfortable thing for us, why we prize it so much. But it ultimately, I think, has this source and goal in God. And in secularism, what we've done is turn all that fluidity 90 degrees towards these purely worldly goals, and in particular, going after the body because of its totemic status, according to my thinking. But we can't really find happiness until we stop trying to construct our own identity and recall our divine origin and ask to receive our identity, ask God, who am I? And turn to him for our identity. So the thing that I could have talked about this whole talk and didn't, is that John Paul II and Ratzinger in particular have emphasized that this difference, this perfect difference of male and female, has a really important theological meaning, that it reveals that God himself is a communion of persons. And so this is Joseph Ratzinger, so Benedict XVI, before he was Pope. The true God is of his own nature, being for Father, being from Son, and being with Holy Spirit. Yet man is in the image of God precisely because the being for, from, and with constitute the basic anthropological shape that we live in. We come from our parents, we're ordered toward living with other human beings and using our thinking and our freedom in order to love those human beings. And so this is the kind of the deepest why, when it comes to why is there the sex body. This is starting to get to the deepest reason, which is, ultimately the reason why we have a sex body is hidden in God alone. But this starts to maybe touch on the deepest theological reasons. So with that, I'll close. And Professor Laughlin at the beginning mentioned that I have some books. They're not directly on the gender topic, but on things related to it. So you can find those at bookstores or check out my website. So with that, I will stop my share and open it up, hand things back over to Sophia for Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Franks. Really, really wonderful. Yes, I see virtual round of applause, not something we would have ever known how to do a year ago, right? Yeah, so I reopened the chat box. So I think now we'll just open it to general Q&A. If you have anything for Dr. Franks you want to put in the chat box, or if you want to speak at your, ask